Welcome, listeners, to episode 28 of Future Secured. And today, in this episode, we're taking on one of the most complex issues in cybersecurity, threat intelligence sharing. But just before we dive in, I've got a favour to ask you. Could you just hit that subscribe button, that like button, jump over to LinkedIn and just follow our Murphin Group page, because we need your help to help us on our mission of getting these stories out of the back rooms and into the public. For years, organisations have been reluctant to openly share threat intelligence, fearing it could expose vulnerabilities or give adversaries an advantage. But in the world of increasingly sophisticated large-scale cyber attacks, the question we're going to ask today is the bigger risk staying silent. And to explore this, we've joined by Stephen Beaumont AM, Non-Executive Director and Chair, and David Sandell, Co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of CI-ISAC, Australia's Critical Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Centre. CI-ISAC exists to enable secure collaboration between critical infrastructure sectors, ensuring the right threat intelligence reaches the right people before it's too late. Thank you, Jason, for joining me as always as my co-host, and thank you, Stephen and David, for joining us today. So over to you, Jason, for the first question. So let's dive in.
Thanks, Tommy. And David and Stephen, thanks for joining us. David, I was trying to think the first time we spoke, I remember, and I just admired you guys, obviously. And when I spoke to you and Scott originally for grafting away, you finally got some money out of the government, much deserved, recently. So I'm sure we'll sort of cover on that, over $6 million, which probably sounds like a lot of money to people. But as we know, with the space and what you're doing, it doesn't really go that far. But it's a great start, and it's a great investment from the the government to sort of back you guys and what you're doing, and in such a critical space as well. So you've come a long way since we first spoke. So just for the listeners, because a lot of people wouldn't be aware of what you do, you mind just kicking off and just giving us a bit of an overview? Tom sort of covered just a little bit there, but just go a little bit more in depth of how you got here, sort of a little bit of your history before, sort of led up to this, because that's quite interesting as well. And then we'll jump through from there.
Oh, well, look, now we'll probably get to intros, but I think it's a good question, Jason. And thanks for inviting us on this podcast too, by the way. It's, to be frank, we've kind of struggled with airtime, I guess. We've been too busy, really, to seek out opportunities, so we're very grateful for this one. But David, why don't you lead off? I mean, you were the founder, so the origin story is yours to tell.
And storytelling is not my forte, but so I've spent my entire career effectively in financial services. As most of the listeners would know, it's a very well-resourced sector. Banks make a lot of money. They invest a lot in their security and their infrastructure and their systems. So I've seen firsthand what that significant investment in both infrastructure and security can enable. Moving to Australia in 2019, having come from Europe, there's quite a disparity between the levels of maturity. So top end of town, still very mature. But as soon as you go back one or two tiers in terms of financial services and other sectors, there's suddenly a massive gulf between the entities that have the resources to invest and the ones that don't. So that effectively forms the core of how Scotty and I imagined the critical infrastructure ISAC. We've both been involved in ISACs in the past. Tom, you did very well putting that together, the Critical Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Centre. It is a mouthful. Steve has told me multiple times we should shorten our name. But fundamentally, what we've done is we've broken apart the traditional ISAC model, which is sharing information intelligence within a specific sector. So this works really well in financial services, lots of maturity, sharing information on cyber threats. Financial services does really well. As soon as you move out to adjacent sectors, so telco, energy, transport, there isn't really that same level of maturity. So the idea that we had was take Australia as your target market. There isn't really an ISAC that services and caters for Australia. The international ISACs are traditionally focused on the US and more of a global perspective, focus in really hard on Australia, but then go across all of those critical infrastructure sectors. And again, learn from the mature sectors to help those less mature sectors. So that's effectively the core of what we've done with the ISAC. We'll get a bit more into how that all happens. The information sharing is a really key part of that, but that really is just the first step. There's all of those resource maturity, just having the time of day to get something done in response to this complete swathe of cyber threats that we're constantly facing every day. And that's really where this not-for-profit CI-ISAC is acting as a vehicle to help enable those capabilities for everyone who's involved in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that was good. That was very good. Now, Stephen, do you want to tack on there?
Yeah, I mean, I plainly, when David and Scotty sort of conceived of this, they were plainly modelling the proposition on the US ISAC model, which of course they kicked off in the late 90s. I mean, my personal theory is the Americans are always basically a half a generation ahead of us in terms of the idea. And it's certainly the case with ISACs. And so right now, there's 18 or thereabouts global ISACs, all based in the US, everything from the automotive industry, real estate, through to financial services and health, which obviously have a significant presence here in Australia. And the big idea from David and Scotty, hey, come on, Australia, we need to do better. We should have our own ISAC. But while we're at it, let's actually break the model. Let's turn it into a cross-sectoral. So why shouldn't the health sector benefit from the wisdom and the insight from the financial sector? Why shouldn't the transport sector, communication sector, space technology, why shouldn't they all be able to collaborate and share as they wish to through a common platform? And that's what CI-ISAC delivers. And I guess just quickly while I've got the mic, I'm an Intel guy, right? I'm not a technologist. I'm not a cyber guy. I spent a bit of time with cyber threat teams in 2004, which seems a long time ago now, supporting national agencies. But most recently, working with Marcus Thompson, we built the ADF cyber capability, or started building the foundations for that, and that work obviously continues in the hands of others. But for me, I look at CI-ISAC and I see that, let's build a national capability that, a bit like the US ISACs, 20 years down the track, 25 years down the track, are enduring, being run and delivering a really good benefit to obviously the members.
Well, so one of the real challenges around this kind of subject is being prepared to share this information, and also being able to share it in a way that doesn't compromise. And so there's a real kind of, I guess, tautology or tension there within it all. So I was wondering if you guys could just slowly kind of peel this back for us, because we know that, when the cyber attacks happen, basically there is an attempt to share this information as far and wide to the key people that can actually then start defending against it. But there's also a great fear of that information then getting back into the hands of criminals. The speed at which this cyber warfare we're engaged in now is moving, though, seems to kind of negate the caution at the level it is now. So I just love both of you just to take a turn to dive into that and discuss that tension and how you've found a way through it.
Perhaps I'll introduce this part, David, and then I'll let you burrow in. I mean, I think one of the lessons we've learned over the last 2.5 years is that culture of sharing amongst industry players is not where it needs to be, for all sorts of logical reasons. Actually, there's plainly the commercial and confidence element, which is natural, where the lawyers around, the executives of any business are going to be pretty defensive in their mindset. And then, of course, you've got the regulatory environment, which is growing seemingly every sort of year. There's a new layer of regulation, and we can talk more about that, because I think it's actually a really important discussion to have. But again, that's another obstacle, if you like. And what's out there as a counterweight to that? At the moment, there's not a lot. There are entities that do sharing. I mean, CISO Lens is a really good example where CISOs get together. It's an awesome capability. We've come on the scene, and a bit different to CISO Lens, we're actually pitching down into the operational layer, to those who are actually monitoring the networks minute by minute, to actually help them and to provide, some help as they configure their networks. But certainly one of our big lessons is that sharing is hard, and moving that cultural mindset is going to take time, and everyone needs to play a part, to be honest. I mean, the ASD report from last year, for example, I think they said they've got 400 partners on CETUS. 400, wow. How many businesses are there in Australia? It's a tiny amount, and so on. But to go to David's point about learning from the more mature players, I mean, our financial sector, I think, is more advanced than most when it comes to sharing, and David was in the trenches in that space, so maybe able to share some insights. But we've got a way to go for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point too. I think, and David, exactly that, right? Is we know in Australia, and you heard the CETUS members, being 400, we know where most of those members are coming from. It is tending to be at the upper end of town. And we know that in Australia that 98.2% of businesses are sort of 20 people or under, as a majority. But the top end sort of do get looked after to a degree. But as Tom said, that and Stephen sort of touched on that threat sharing is a really difficult balance to get, isn't it? What you can share, what you can't. I know Dan Tripovich at ASD, fairly well, and he has a bit of difficulty with these sorts of things as well. It's a challenge here in this country, probably more so than a lot of others. But what have you found, or what's your sort of way of sort of cracking that nut to try and help and assist in this space?
We're making holes in the nut. I think we haven't quite cracked it yet. We'd be lying if we said we had. It is a really hard problem to solve. We could literally spend an hour talking about headwinds, and we probably wouldn't have scratched the surface. I think fundamentally it comes back to individuals and priorities and culture, really, those three aspects. So you find the right individuals, and this is something we've learned through our journey. You find someone who gets it, they get the value, they belong to sharing networks. You don't need to convince them because they clearly understand the value of sharing. And there's a really good community, as Steve alluded to, within CI-ISAC. There's any number of other communities doing the same thing. The challenge with those communities when you want to have or make an impact at a national level is they don't scale out easily to operational outcomes. So there's a lot of awareness building. You get a very quick insight into a cyber threat or an incident, or there's a technical indicator that comes out. People go and have a look in their networks. The onus is still on the recipients to go and do the work. And this is the core problem with critical infrastructure. Even existing federal initiatives like CITES, the information flows down the wire. You still need the recipients to go off and do things. They need to understand the threats. They need to build the context. They need to assess their environment. At the end of the day, we're in the business of trying to reduce that cyber risk across all of Australia. That's what we're all trying to do here today. Sharing information is only that first piece of that. You need to make sense of it. So this is where we've, I guess, tried to carve out a gap, is looking to actually drive those operational outcomes. So very much focusing on take the snippets of information, make it as low overhead as possible for people to share into the ecosystem. So you give them really easy mechanisms to share. You don't create any more overhead on their day jobs than you need to. You give them guidance. We put really good protections around anything that is shared. So anonymity, confidentiality, really key. Nothing is ever attributed back to the person that's sharing that information in. So that does kind of help alleviate some of those concerns. But yes, at the end of the day, there is that residual concern on if this got out, might be an in-flight incident, would this reflect negatively on my organization? So we do a lot to protect the contributors. But most importantly, and again, back to the limitation of these specific groups that share within sectors or within specific areas of the economy, someone shares something in, the upside and benefit of that sharing is limited to that one group. So being a not-for-profit, CI-ISAC really is trying to be the glue that brings all of these various groups together. So we do try and partner first, tapping into the groups, then feeding anything via the anonymized mechanisms to the intel office. The cyber threat intelligence requires specialized skills. You've got expensive resources, you've got tools and commercial feeds that you pay for. All of that helps you make sense of these snippets of information. So you're not just dealing with an IP address or a hash anymore. You've related that to a specific cyber threat, a specific technique. When you start building some color and picture around that, and then getting that information out to people, then you can start kind of shifting the dial in terms of people understanding their risk, not having to do a lot of running around. And that's when you start actually making a difference in terms of people being able to protect their environments.
I think one of the things that's really interesting around this too is the challenge of, so we've got this kind of threat intelligence sharing piece of information, but it's actually how much impact that is going to have on the business. I remember we recently spoke to Air Canada's head of security, and they were talking about, having 400,000 vulnerabilities and basically having to kind of put some intelligence around that, because in some cases, exploits haven't ever been taken advantage of. So how do you share that information and not just overload people? You actually provide them with things that they can take action on, because I think that's another key part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've taken a quality over quantity approach from the outset. Again, this is another shift from a traditional ISAC approach. Traditional ISACs might put out 3,000 alerts a year, which is a pretty big number. Again, think about the teams receiving those. You've got 1 or 2 cyber people. You're suddenly dealing with 8 to 10 advisories a day you've got to make sense of. There might be indicators. There's work to do. What we've done from the outset is wrapping context. So exactly to your point, Tom, you've got a vulnerability. How bad is this? Does it require authentication? Is it complicated to exploit? Is there an active campaign? Is it known to be exploited by threat actors or threat groups that have targeted critical infrastructure in the past? Is it some obscure piece of software that may live underneath your accounting system that you might not even realize is a problem? So all of that context helps the teams prioritize. So you explain what the threat or the vulnerability is, put the context around it. That helps people get a bit of breathing space. Or if it is something critical, we had one in VMware last week, down tools, focus all your teams on this one vulnerability, because if someone gets in or exploits this, we've got significant issues. So the context is really, really key to that. And to your point on Air Canada, 400,000 vulnerabilities, it's one of those things you just never catch up with, because there's always going to be the noise, and that's just your, I guess, latent residual risk that you need to accept in your environment. What you really want to understand it, or what are those top 10 to 20% you need to be focusing your available resources on? The ones that you are going to accept, what are those compensating controls from a security perspective that you can wrap around those? And again, where the context and recommendations and advice come in, what can you do to figure out if X low priority vulnerability does become a problem in your environment? What sort of detections or notifications can you wrap around those? So that's all of the, I guess, the secret sauce when it comes to cyber and cyber threat intelligence. There's a lot of highly skilled people in Australia doing an amazing job of doing that for their companies, but effectively the challenge is everyone else who doesn't have those people in their organizations. How do we make that knowledge, that experience accessible to the rest of critical infrastructure? No one entity can protect everyone, which is why we need to work together and effectively collaborate, bring information together and get that to the right people.
Yeah, and that number you spoke about, like that Air Canada number, that's not unusual for the big banks here. That sort of same vulnerability sort of number, as you'd know, David. So we're sort of talking in that same realm, and these can flare up pretty quickly. So they can look pretty nonplussed there for a while. They could be drifting along, in low single-digit percentiles, and then all of a sudden, overnight, they can spike up to a 50% threat, up to 80, and so within sort of like a 48 or 72-hour period, it can just go from virtually nothing up to something. So monitoring that and getting all these feeds is critical, isn't it? Yeah, and getting the right feeds, because, as you said, there's a lot of noise coming in from that point of view, and then you've got to disseminate that and then pass that through as well. So the filtering process you guys must go through, I don't envy you, and thank you for doing it, because that is one job I would not want to have.
Well, I'm very grateful to the federal government for awarding us the grant, because we now have a team of people. I'm not doing it off the side of my desk on evenings and weekends. So that personally is a significant step change for me. But yeah, there is just so much noise out there. And this is one of the ludicrous things that we observe is everyone is doing this themselves. They're paying for the feeds, they're monitoring the open sources.
Yep.
You've got teams of people across these organizations all doing the same thing. And that just doesn't make sense to me. It's something we're trying to change, but I appreciate it's a culture thing. People are used to working in specific ways. The threat actors know that working together works really well. They've been collaborating for years, sharing malware techniques, information they find, credentials. So it clearly works from the attacker's perspective. We just kind of have to get it right from the defender's perspective, and then tip the balance in terms of our ability to respond and then be resilient to these threats.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's something that Tom would want to ask as well. But I'd wonder, in what I've heard, and I've heard mixed stuff on this, but that the machine learning or AI aspect of things has made things somewhat easier. And I'm talking about, and I know probably similar people to what you guys know, is that a lot of those feeds coming in now, they can actually overlay those and actually get those done with an AI type tool or bot, which was a manual process previously, which has actually made that process a bit easier to disseminate and break stuff down. And they sort of did find that a lot of the feeds they were paying for, there was a lot of feeds that were basically doing the same thing, which were pretty much piggybacking off. So they've actually reduced some costs somewhat in some ways, found that feeds were very similar from some, just different badges, but also that there were some that were a lot better than others. And AI had or the machine learning component of that has actually really assisted their team in that. Is that something you guys are utilizing from your end? And has that improved or helped or hindered you in any way? Because I know the attackers, obviously, as we discussed, are using it quite successfully as well. But has it helped you on this side to try and mitigate some of that feed coming through?
So we don't use AI yet. So we do use it for some reframing of terminology and wording. We don't use it for any filtering at this stage or any recommendations. We have humans doing that. That said, AI is incredible when it comes to synthesizing information. The jury is slightly out when it comes to generating information. It's very much a trust but verify situation, or trust if you dare. But Yeah, it is incredible. And all of the main security vendors have overlaid these AI components. Yes, you can use it to monitor the open sources. It's a great way of chucking human legible language into the model going, tell me about X or Y threat. There's two challenges with that. The one is access to those capabilities in the first place. Again, it comes back to those resources. But then you still need the person that is receiving those results to have enough experience to know when something isn't quite right. It's kind of the sniff test. If you've been in the game long enough, you know when something doesn't sound quite right. If you try and use AI too heavily in the cybersecurity space, you start to see these things creep in. And that's one of the reasons we're not reliant on it. We've built a very robust process around individuals. There is automated monitoring, don't get me wrong. We're not just sitting there clicking through links manually. There's a lot of automated monitoring and filtering, but it's not AI doing the actual filtering. It's logic and sources that we've curated. So you still do need those humans. But again, as we just kind of take one step back to the less resourced end of town, which, if we're honest, is probably 80% of critical infrastructure, even some of these really big hospital networks that we've started working with as part of the grant, they might have hundreds of servers. They've got 3 cyber people. One of them is a project person, 2 other cyber people. Like, the ratio of cyber expertise to infrastructure that they're looking to protect. Then you start chucking in all the legacy infrastructure, the complexities of healthcare, supply chain. AI is a massive boon, yes, for the attackers.
And lack of budget.
All sorts. Lack of budget. It comes back to the resources at the end of the day. There's any number of challenges and problems. So you can carve it up any number of ways. AI is a great enabler. It can definitely help people be more effective, filter information. It can help on the defense and the attack side in different use cases. I don't believe it's an umbrella boon or bane to cybersecurity, but yes, in specific use cases like synthesizing information or analyzing alerts or putting a bit of basic context based on environmental context around alerts, it's incredible for that. And tapping into sources on the attacker side of things, yes, you can weaponize things quicker, you can tailor content, you can research people. But yeah, it very much depends on how you're applying that, whether it's a good or a bad use case.
To put it really simply, there's a technical layer. There's a sort of a push system where we push out advisories, and then of course there's the human-to-human interaction where people come in and they share sort of their stories face to face. And we're not talking to differentiate from the CI-ISAC lens, where it's the CISO, it's actually the operators who are comparing notes. Did you want to talk about that, David? Because I think that's actually a really powerful framework for us. And as we mature, again, I'm an Intel guy, you'd expect me to say this, is that, that real tie-in with members, what are your requirements? What do you actually need? Let's help you understand your environment, and we can have perhaps a better discussion about tailoring support for particular entities.
So I might leave all the Intel 101 stuff to one side, things like what are the requirements, what do members want to know, what do they care about, like all the standard cyber threat vectors. That goes into the conversation. In terms of mechanisms and how we engage the members, we effectively created a structure where we've got a cross-sectoral sharing forum called a National Threat Intel Forum. That's where you have leads from the various sectors that come together. They talk about the cyber threats, the cyber incidents they've seen within their organizations. And I'll never forget the first one we ever had. You could literally see the light bulbs go off in people's eyes as the conversation started. And that's when we knew we were onto a winner in terms of the cross-sectoral approach. We always knew that cyber threats are not sector-specific. Yes, there's technology-specific threats or threats that target healthcare more specifically, but most of what we're seeing and most of what we have to deal with and the main cyber incidents that we've seen in the headlines, the techniques, the vectors, they span multiple sectors. So getting these folks together, having the conversations, encouraging people to share, stimulating those conversations with context and observations that we've seen from our own analysis and monitoring. It really comes down to those human interactions and just talking through these threats and how that's impacted the entity, what certain members have done in response to the threats. This is where CI-ISAC, again, is a real facilitator and enabler for these conversations, because it's not like some of these forums where you have a conversation, everyone feels massively invigorated. 5 minutes after you've left the room, you go back to your day jobs, there's a dumpster fire and you've forgotten about the conversation. So nothing happens. So we take all that information, again, we anonymize it, we triage it, we do the analysis, and then we get these advisories with that context, with the recommendations out to all of the members. So any interaction is benefiting the wider membership base, but we're tapping into those more mature members in those facilitated sessions both cross-sectorally, and then as we get the critical masses across within sectors, we'll have an energy intel forum, health, transport, so on and so forth. So you really have the ability to kind of see what's going on at a macro level, but also within sectors, what's happening. We can add those related perspectives from the other forums that we're also sitting in. So everyone is constantly learning and getting that context and feedback from what's going in across the ecosystem. Then there's all the other technical mechanisms. People and members can share at any point via the portal. They can send that to the Intel office. Same process. Analyze the information. If it needs to be written into an advisory, that goes out. So there's a common thread here where just those snippets of information, the interactions they're built on, we put the context around them and then get that out so that it's a really efficient way of getting relevant information on the threats that Australian critical infrastructure members need to know about into their inboxes. They can assess their risk. If they need to do something, great. If they don't, they move on with their day. But they're always getting these kind of snippets of, this is what's being observed, this is what it means for you, and this is what you need to do if it impacts you. Very quick process to assess that and then mobilize or move on with their day. So multiple mechanisms, but it is structured in that way to bring people together and very much driving those outcomes. All of the interactions, the facilitation is geared around getting information into the intelligence office, that's analyzed, and then that helps members kind of act and defend themselves.
Fantastic. And Stephen, I'd love you to kind of, as the chair, help us understand, the gap that you really identified there and the people that were getting left behind. I mean, there's more than 2.6 million active registered businesses in Australia. You just mentioned 400, contributed to that ASD report. That's a massive gap. So what you guys were obviously very, very aware of people that weren't getting looked after here and have made this choice to kind of reach in and build this organisation. So tell us a bit about that gap and your plans to close it over the next few years.
Yeah. So why don't we start with the health sector, plainly because that's very topical and we've got some resources to go after that. So that's a very fragmented sector. It's arguably the largest sector within critical infrastructure in Australia. But it's more than just hospitals that might have some systems of national significance under their roof, for example. It's that whole continuum from hospitals down through to GP clinics, through to supporting businesses, whether they're insurance businesses, to be honest, whether they are aged care facilities. It's a very broad church. And plainly our bid, we aim to engage with all of that in a meaningful way and give all of those businesses an opportunity to come and join us and to get what we would describe as a pretty affordable CTI service that is tailored to meet their needs. So that big gap, we're going to be very active on, as you'd expect. As I said to the cyber coordinator just the other day, I regard our plan that you approved as basically our contract. So, as far as I'm concerned, we're under contract of government to deliver, to address that gap. And we'll give it a red hot go. And we think we'll be successful there because our model, I think, is good. It's proven the test of time. But we've got to get active. It's not just a matter of build it and they will come. You actually need to go out and educate and turn people's mind to this. Because in spite of the threats and in spite of the very public examples of what can go wrong in this domain, what we're learning is that, for many, many businesses, this is really hard. It's too hard, and they might just throw the problem over to the fence to their MSP and hope for the best. Now, we're delivering a CTI service. It's not the alpha and omega here. It's really just perhaps the first block that you need to lay down as you start to get serious about resilience. As we mature, we'll hope to deliver other services, but that CTI service we think is a foundational block, and we will do an education campaign in the health sector to get members of that sector aligned onto what we're offering, and in due course bring as many of them on board as we can. I mean, we're not naive. We don't intend to boil the ocean here necessarily, and we're not so naive as to think we're going to get every member of those sectors, but with health in particular, we're going to make that a big rump of CI-ISAC's membership community going forward. Education. One other lesson that we've learned is that for where businesses have a CTI service, perhaps it's very it's actually quite difficult to get those entities to sort of lift and shift, if you like. Notwithstanding sort of, we're not for profit, so we're affordable, obviously. We've got Australia at the end, so we are a sovereign entity. We're not a US-based global ISAC, which, to be frank, services, all around the world, but they prioritise plainly US members. So in spite of some of that logical argument, getting people to lift and shift is hard, but it's an ongoing campaign, and we're in for the long haul.
Yeah, I'll maybe just add one aspect to the piece you alluded to. So if you take the 2.6 million members, potential members, so the entities that need protecting, it's really about figuring out innovative ways to do more with less. If you put $50 as an allocation against each of those, you'd get no change for $100 million. No one is going to throw $100 million at protecting these entities. So part of what we are really looking to do is, again, collaborating with the participants of the ecosystem. So you're not paying for these services. Yes, there will be costs to run certain services from an infrastructure perspective, but the knowledge, the experience, the kinds of things you'd normally have to spend months and years learning, by getting contributions from the members to help build those capabilities. So things like, if you look at the really immature members, if you can wrap protective controls around them. So if there's a breach on some third-party site, assume Netflix, you notify them if their corporate domain or if their email addresses have been in that breach. So suddenly you're not dealing with a password reuse issue where someone breaks into their network. Just having those basic capabilities, things like scanning their perimeter with their permission to look for exposures. Is there an exposed remote desktop port? Is there a misconfiguration on a piece of software that we know is vulnerable? Again, notifying them. So reducing the work they need to do, but still giving them those snippets of really relevant information that help move them from reactive, where, there's someone in my network, to, okay, if I don't deal with this in a timely manner, it's likely something will happen. Yes, there's the edge case where the nation state actor is potentially in the network already, but that's the edge case. So we're really just wrapping as much as we can around these smaller and medium members with support and experience from the larger end of town. To Steve's point on the not-for-profit, everything that comes in from a membership fee perspective is reinvested. So there's no commercial upside to any of this. I know that might go without saying, being a not-for-profit, but fundamentally, every member who comes onto CI-ISAC owns an equal portion of the company. So Steve, myself, the board, Scotty and I being founders, we have no commercial interest in the company. It is the members that own the company. So it's our duty under the Constitution to really drive that value for the members. And that's something we feel very strongly about. It's why we've been doing this for 2 years as volunteers, and we'll continue to invest the grant funding and all the membership fees and reinvesting into building capabilities for the members. And I feel like that's what's really going to make the difference when it comes to having an impact at scale, because there isn't another vehicle or entity that is looking to drive operational outcomes, specifically in the cyberspace, that will directly support the members. So wrapping security controls, giving them pertinent information, and then as we mature over time, wrapping service-based support around those entities. So when something does happen, we can work with the likes of ASD to support them if there isn't capacity centrally.
I was going to say that's really important, and I'm glad you sort of put that out there. And I think that's why we like to do this, to get the information out there, because I think a lot of people sit back and see these sorts of things and they sort of think that, and David and I remember when we first spoke, sort of kindred spirits. I was at Cyber at the time and sort of probably a little bit hamstrung with what I could do. And similarly, that's why we sort of set up the Australian Cyber Network, and why Tom sort of and I do the work we do, and the stuff with Dynamic Standards International, that sort of stuff, is that, and with ACN, it's a not-for-profit one. But a lot of the pot shots you often get externally is, you guys are just out there to sort of make some coin for yourselves. And it's like, I fucking wish we were. There are people out there that genuinely want to lift the whole, security, because we're so far behind here in Australia in particular. And it's pretty easy for the peanuts to sit on the sidelines and throw stones all the time. But, I take my hat off to what you guys are doing, and Stephen for backing it, as chair. I think, it really needs to be recognised that this is something that you guys are doing as a piece of work. And I know when Tom and I were doing our work recently with, you mentioned the cyber coordinator there, Michelle McGuinness, she did specifically call you guys out, as a piece of work, and something I think the government's proud to sort of be behind as well. So I think, how can we help? What I want to do is this next step, or next question, is really, what do you need? You sort of mentioned, there's 2.6 million potential members out there, and it'd be great to get as many of them for benefit of what you're doing, but also to protect them. So what if we're going to do a call out? What can we say, and what do we need to help you guys to sort of get to the next stage, or to sort of help and protect more people in this country?
I want to have first swing at that, David, and then I'll let you go. I think there's a couple of themes. I think one of the first themes is Australian interests first. There is, and this is a message, I guess, for those who work in sectors where there may be a global ISAC present. And while we talk a lot about the junior players, we are in tight conversation with some very large entities that are significant members of some of those ISACs, with the objective of moving them. So I think one of the first messages is, look, I think while cyber threats are they're surely global, there's also, the cyber actors that work against us, they're not stupid. They understand that each nation state have their own settings, and they will go to where there may be some opportunity. And so a sovereign approach to this just makes sense, so that we're focused in on the Australian members, and we sort of cater to their requirements. I should also quickly add, while I'm on the topic, that doesn't mean we're going to close our minds to working with the global ISACs, because plainly they're going to generate some insights from outside of our shores that will be of potential benefit to the members here in Australia. So I think that's, Australians helping Australians, industry for industry, I think is a really important message. I think collective defence we've spoken about it. I mean, I'm an army guy. I think of army units. When you're on the front line, neighbouring units are locked in and they're sharing information all the time. Why? Because your neighbouring unit gets hit one night, you want to know what happened, so that you can look to your own defences and make sure when you get hit, your defences are appropriately postured. So that idea of collective defence, it's okay to share. We can anonymise data. You're not giving away your trade secrets. We can talk about regulation and SOC and all of that, but we probably don't have time. But, CTI insights, are not a compromise necessarily that, you're going to have to report to government. You can share CTI observations quite easily and simply. You just need to turn your mind to it and adjust your cultural sort of setting, if you like. It's in your business, your shareholders' interests to do so. I think that's probably they're the 2 points that I would sort of make, I guess, for those that you talk to.
Yeah, I mean, at its core, awareness is one of our biggest challenges. Just getting that actual reach out to entities that even know we exist, what we're trying to do. There's a lot of education, and this is one of the things that's really hamstrung us in the last 2 years. Is just building that level of understanding of what sharing enables, what cyber threat intelligence is. There's a lot of preconceptions about what intelligence is, how it can help. People think, we get all these feeds, we've got our intelligence sorted, why do we need another entity? When you actually peel back those layers and you talk through some of the, I guess, enabling factors of getting involved in an entity like this, it's very powerful. So we need to really, as much as possible, break people out of the mindset of, I'm all right, Gov, we've got our organization sorted, we've got enough investment, we don't need to get involved in yet another initiative. This was designed and built as a national capability meant to endure over time. So I've already started talking to Steve about the 3-year plan. Like yourself, Jason, and Tom, we plan to move away from this in time once it is established, once it's fully firing. It will be it is a national capability, but it will endure as a national capability. We're not going to cling on to this for our lives. We've got CI-ISAC International to build in time. Australia is the test bed. This is the only cross-sectoral ISAC in the world. There's been a lot of noise that's come out of the woodwork in the last 2 years about looking across sectors. Everyone thought we were nuts in the first place. They were like, you can't go across sectors, but people's views have changed over time. So there clearly is merit in this. We've seen it firsthand. So even anything that anyone can do to help raise awareness, point people in our direction so we can have the conversation with them is massively beneficial. So we really need to just co-opt and get as many of those mature members involved early on to see more of the ecosystem. And then our job is to harness and galvanize that information, those collaborations, to benefit all those less mature members. And that's what the grant funding enables us to do, first and foremost in the healthcare sector. But the other benefit of building this cross-sectoral ISAC is everything we build for the health sector benefits the other sectors. So it's not like we commission things and say, sorry, energy, sorry, transport, you can't use that. It benefits all of the sectors. So it is truly one of these investments that kind of helps rise the tide and benefits all of the participants in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think if I could just tighten the bow, the benefit is sort of an accessible, enriched CTI service, and accessible insofar as it's affordable, and we don't leave the small players behind, and enriched because it's enriched by the sharing from other entities. It's not just a pay-as-you-go CTI service. You're actually sharing some real live stories that could be of significant interest to you. And if you don't sign up to CI-ISAC, you'll never know.
Fantastic. And look, thank you both for joining us today. This has been a really, really great conversation. And look, personally, I just want to say thank you to David, Stephen, and Jason. I mean, people, listeners that are out there, they're not making a coin out of this particular part. They're doing it because they actually just want to secure everyone in Australia. If you've been listening today, I reckon you're one of those potential 2.6 million members of CI-ISAC. So reach out, go to the website, find David and Stephen on LinkedIn, join the conversation, and don't be someone throwing rocks from the side. Be part of the conversation, building this constructive future so together we can secure Australia. So thank you, David. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you again, Jason, for joining me as always.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Tom.
Good session. Well done.